Very grateful for everyone who's come along to see how uh, this series of lectures comes to the gripping conclusion. I can't say it's going to be as dramatic as to the end of Star Wars or The Sopranos or anything like that, but I hope you come away both engaged, informed, edified, and also stimulated to think about church and state relationships in the very volatile time we live in of the 21st century. Again, to recap what we've looked at, we sort of started talking about church and state relationships by, delving a bit into Romans, where Paul's saying things like, we should submit to governing authorities, but one day the root of Jesse will rise to rule over the nations. And we also then looked at, what should our relationship to the state be? Is it possible as well to engage in civil disobedience? And we said maybe we think there are occasions that call for civil disobedience, maybe even uncivil disobedience from time to time. After that, we then looked at the type of people we might be called to resist, particularly in this day and age, given our history in the world, where we've got fascist and communist regimes. But there's also more immediate dangers, or things, I guess, more relevant to our context, the attraction or even the seduction of Christian nationalism. And then we have also civic totalism, where progressive governments want to reorder certain elements of their citizens' lives in a way that makes the state ultimate. Added to that, I then set forth the case for a benign and benevolent view of secularism. In sum, we don't want to replace the king, the governor general, or even the prime minister with a pope, ayatollah, Dalai Lama, or chief rabbi, because that's bad for religion. At the same time, we don't want the state telling us how to do our religion or punishing us because they don't like our religion. What I want to look forward, what I want to kind of cover in this lecture is how do we build for the kingdom in the political context that we find ourselves? How do we do church and state relationships where some people are very eager, maybe too eager, to offer patronage to Christians and to offer them an access to political power, and then maybe some in the church are very eager to receive it as well. And then there are those who really just wish the church would, wither away into nothing and would not shed their meddlesome opinions about matters that they think should not concern them. How do we build for the kingdom in that kind of context? I want to start by telling you two stories from the British context. Many years ago, some decades now, the then British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, was doing an interview, I think, with Vanity Fair magazine, where he was asked about religion. And just before Blair was about to answer, and Blair Tony Blair is a person of faith, his media advisor, jumped in and said, Downing Street does not do God. Okay, so that was clearly, one view of church and state. Never the twain shall meet. Keep them far apart from each other, if you like. These things should not be put together. You can't mix politics and religion. But to give another example, by a following subsequent Prime Minister, David Cameron, he was commenting on a synod in the Church of England, where it was expected that the Church of England would pass a motion to allow women to be bishops in the Church of England. But when it came down to a vote in the various houses, the House of Bishops, the House of Priests and Clergy, and the House of the Laity, it didn't win the support of all three houses. Therefore, it didn't get through. And David Cameron was quite upset about this, and he said the church needs to get with the program. And there were some who even wanted to legislate forcing the Church of England to have women in the episcopacy, women bishops. So there you've got two very different responses just in England. One on the idea that religion and politics should be, set apart like an acid and a base, and another one where you get something nakedly Erastian. Erastianism means, state intervention in religious affairs, telling people how they should do their religion. So there's this. So even within like living memory, I can think of two quite extreme cases. But where we live, we are people who are our allegiance principally to King Jesus. Although we may want to be good citizens of Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Nigeria, wherever we are, we be good citizens. Our allegiance is fundamentally to King Jesus. And how do we contribute, advocate, promote, or even build for the kingdom in this day and age where you've got very extreme views of church-state relationship? Now, when I use that language, build for the kingdom, some people can be a little bit, and I think rightly, alarmed or a bit misapprehensive about it. Because the idea that you can build the kingdom by your own works and your own labors, that can go very badly. I think yesterday I said one of the downsides of Marxism is they think they can manufacture, a paradise of peasants and workers through some 5-year plans, some gulags, guillotines, and some work camps, and a bit of propaganda. By their own human means and devices, they can create paradise on earth, and that always seems to end badly. And I know a number of songs that use the language of building Jerusalem. There's a famous British hymn called Jerusalem, and it was written during the Second World War. And if you read it, that the subtext is the way you build Jerusalem is by going to France and killing Germans. That's that's the subtext of the song Jerusalem. But on the other day, I was listening to a wonderful hymn of messianic praise by Jewish Christians, Messianic Christians, and it's a great song, and it's called "The Lord is Building Jerusalem." Sorry, I promised Steve I wouldn't sing again, and I've broken my promise. But it's a great little song, but it's actually a quote from a Israeli prime minister in the 1960s, Golda Meir, and it's about how the Israeli government will not give up Jerusalem to the Palestinians or to the Jordanian government. So there's a kind of a political subtext there. Now, I do not want to get into the Israel-Palestine debate that's happening in another seminar room. But again, there's kind of a subtext there that we can sing hymns about religious hymns, worship hymns about things that have nakedly political origins, and some of those political origins may be a little bit suspicious, suspect, or at least morally complex. So there is the danger that the language of building Jerusalem can be used for some kind of theocratic Christian nationalism. Be that as it may, I believe that the biblical witness shows that human beings are meant to participate in divine rule, or at least divine custodianship over the world. Adam and Eve are created in the image of God, and that image, well, I think it's a particular status that human beings are given. It's a particular status that they are precious to God, but that image is also given in the sense that they're to represent divine rule on the earth. So humans are to engage in creaturely participation of divine sovereignty. And that's why Adam and Eve, when they're put in the garden, they're in the image of God, and they're meant to have dominion and sovereignty over all the animals and the creatures of the earth. So there's a sense in the image of God has a vocation for us, which you could describe as environmental custodianship, making the earth a paradise for all people, and even for the animal kingdom. And then we could look at something like Psalm 8, very famous psalm, where it says, "You have given them, humans, dominion over the work of your hands. You have put all things under their feet." Now, that task reaches its climax in the person of Jesus. He becomes the human, the ultimate human, who has custodianship of not just the earth, but indeed the entire universe. He's something of Yahweh or God the Father's vice regent. And this is an important thing we have to remember. When Jesus ascends to heaven, he doesn't kind of disrobe himself of his humanity and go, ugh, take off this ridiculous monkey suit. Kind of like, ugh, icky, icky. It's all sweaty and moist. He doesn't. He doesn't kind of, he doesn't take off his humanity. He doesn't turn into like, Casper the Friendly Ghost or something like that. Okay? When the Lord Jesus gets to heaven, he has his glorified, very physical human body. And he is exalted at the Father's right hand in his human body. If I can just tell a good Sunday school joke. In heaven, God the Father has to use his left hand. And do you know why? Because Jesus is sitting on his right hand. Sorry, I had to throw that in. But Jesus is the human being who is exercising sovereignty over creation, a la Psalm 8. And human beings, principally the church, eventually they are going to participate in the sovereignty of Jesus Christ over the affairs of the universe. And that's why you find it repeated, I think in Paul's letters and at least twice in the book of Revelation, saying in the new creation, we will reign with Christ. Okay? Now, I don't know what that means. Me personally, I want to be known as Minister for Ginger Ale. I want to make sure the new creation is stacked with the correct type of ginger ale, and we all know the correct answer is Canada Dry. There will be Canada Dry in the new creation because I'm going to ask the Lord Jesus to make me the cosmic minister for ginger ale. But so we are designed to participate in the new creation. Now, danger is if you take an over-realized view of that and say, well, I'm going to be the minister for ginger ale in the new creation, so maybe I should be the, governor of New Brunswick in this creation. It'll be a good warm-up act for my portfolio of ginger ale affairs, or something like that. I mean, there is the danger when you take this view, it can be susceptible to this over-realized eschatology, and I want to take that future hope and I want to collapse it into the present. And that's why we have to remember a second important point. At the end of the day, despite our own efforts, our own ministry, ultimately it is God who builds God's kingdom. Okay? The eradication of death, the silencing of the nations that rage against the Lord, the end of all tears, that will not be done by us. When you get to the new creation, there's not going to be a sign saying, brought to you from the people who made New York and New Brunswick. The new creation will be an act of God. But here's the qualification I want to make. I believe there will be continuity between this creation and the new creation. Because I believe in the final size, what we have is not simply the complete dissolution of the present order, not simply like burning it and starting it again. You might say it's a new creation, but it's something of a renovation of creation. I mean, in the book of Revelation, it's the language of heaven and earth coming together in a great marriage. So the earth is healed, restored, not just returned to Edenic bliss, but it exceeds it with something greater than we can even possibly imagine. But the things we do here will echo in that eternity. Sitting down with a child, helping them to read, sharing the gospel to someone, being with a friend who is anxious or in despair, standing up for what is right, refusing to be silent when everyone else is cowering, taking a casserole around to someone who is grieving. The good things we do in our witness, our ministry, in our compassion, in our courage, these things will not merely be recognized. We will see their influences in the new creation. The good that we do will be sanctified and glorified in God's new world. And then this is why I remembered of the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. This is how he ends that chapter. He's been kind of talking about the importance of the resurrection. It's not dispensable. No, I know Greeks may think the resurrection is kind of like the zombie apocalypse, but that's not what it is. Okay? He talks about the nature of the resurrection body, and he talks about the beauty, the wonder, and the necessity of resurrection and new creation. And this is what Paul says. He ends on it basically with a call to get busy in the business of the kingdom. Listen to how 1 Corinthians 15 ends after this long discourse. He says, "So, my dear family, be firmly fixed, unshakable, always full to overflowing with the Lord's work. In the Lord, as you know, the work you're doing will not be worthless." Now, these things will indeed echo into eternity. And that's what we've got to think of our own work. We are not simply biding time, treading water until the end of history, till things tarry no more. Now, the example we could use here to describe that is perhaps someone building a cathedral, in the pews of which you may never sit. I mean, there's an old saying: wise men plant trees in shade that they'll never sit in. Okay, we are contributing to something that is bigger than ourselves, and we may never see, the final product. Some of those cathedrals in Europe, it took like hundreds of years to build them. If you started building it, it may not even be your grandchildren who would see the final product, the final completion of that. And I think that's a good analogy for what we do. Again, we're not manufacturing the kingdom in its fullness, only God does that. But there is a sense in which some of the bricks that we lay down on the foundation of Christ, that will be part of the edifice. That will be part of the structure that's erected. Maybe there will be a little brick, a little tile, a little shelter, or a little garden that in your own way you were there to create. That's what we're to do, provide bricks for the coming cathedral of God's new creation. But that leads to a bit of a further question. How does that relate to ourselves and things like church-state relationship? Okay, if you're let's assume you're vaguely convinced on my thesis here about building the kingdom, or you're at least willing to give me a fair hearing. I don't see anyone, getting up, pitchforks saying, "Avert your eyes, children, he may change form," or anything like that, which is a pretty good sign. Albeit no one's throwing vegetables at me, or even worse, cans of Canada Dry. Let's say you accept the idea that we do, in a sense, build for the kingdom. What does that mean for our political engagement? Now, again, let me say there is the danger that we can see our own political advocacy as building for the kingdom. And it's very easy to shift from the idea that I believe in preacherly participation in divine rule, with a little bit too much over-realized eschatology, and the next thing is saying, with God on our side, we'll make the nation great again. I have to say, there is a risk on this view going from one to another. But I do believe Christians can, in a sense, build for the kingdom by serving in public office, by serving in the public service, by having a political opinion and sharing it with wisdom, with grace, and doing it for the common good. What we need to do then is to be aware of the dangers of seduction. I've seen a couple of good Christian people go into politics, and then they got sucked into the machine, and they just became partisan swamp monsters. To be fair, and it was really depressing seeing. I know that guy, I know that woman, I know what they're like. But as soon as they get put through the sausage maker, they simply then come out as a typical career politician, and it's quite depressing when you see that. When they play the religious card when it suits them, or they're willing to use religion simply as a prop for their own political antics, and sometimes they're not very impressive. But I don't think, and this is the thing, Christians are not called to be hegemonic or simply to create privileges for other Christians. And I think this is one of the things we really have to distinguish. It's fine, it's good. I think it's necessary to want to bear Christian witness in our parliaments, in private, in public, in the right setting, even in our pulpits, okay? But the purpose is never so simply Christians can be hegemonic, okay? Or the idea that we have a kind of like sort of the divine right of kings. You could call it the divine right of evangelicals to be in charge of the nation. We don't want to have that. It's never power for power's own sake. What we need to do is to be willing to offer public witness and draw on the wisdom of the Christian tradition and argue that this is good for all people. Now, this can go a number of different ways. There are some topics, if which you speak up on, you'll simply be accused of being a culture warrior. Now, and to be honest, there are sometimes Christians can unfortunately be known for the things that they are against rather than the things they are for. You know, I don't want to be known, for some things like, I don't know, trying to ban dancing or things worse than that, I guess. I don't want to be known for things like that are merely the outward symbols of a formerly Christian era. Like I think I was telling you, in Australia, we open up the Parliament with the Lord's Prayer, which at one level I kind of like because it represents our Christian heritage, but I don't think that's the hill I want to die on. And I could fully understand if people said, well, because we have a secular government, which in the right sense is a good thing, I don't mind if they get rid of it. So, I want to make that the hill to die on, and to make that, we've got to make sure this nation is Christian and there's prayer in Parliament. That's not what we want to do. There are other things we can advocate for. In the sort of the two things the Lord has laid on my heart is advocating for religious freedom, a fair and equitable account of religious freedom in government, in law, and in practice, balanced with various anti-discrimination laws. This is something I have done. Now, I believe I'm doing that out of sincere Christian witness. Some people regard me as engaging in the culture wars. Similarly, I've been very animated and tried to be a zealous advocate against the gambling lobby because I find they're so pernicious. I mean, their business model is to create as much gambling addiction as possible. Their method is entice, enslave, exploit, and they do it with clinical efficiency. Now, I grew up with a parent who was a gambling addict, and I've seen the dehumanizing effect against it. And I don't consider myself merely an anti-gambling activist. I can consider myself an anti-gambling fanatic, because fanaticism is the purest form of love. It's also the most dangerous form of love. It can go a few different ways. But I am zealous, and people say, well, like all these Christians trying to stop Australians just having a gamble, just go back to your churches, stop trying to impose your moral values on us. If you do advocate for things, you can have people calling you a culture warrior, or people calling you a meddlesome priest, or all sorts of things. But sometimes you've got to be a bit meddlesome. When you're trying to protect people from widespread exploitation, when you're trying to defend your right to practice your faith and promote the gospel without receiving punitive actions from wider society, or preventing people being sacked merely because they belong to a house of worship. These are things we should advocate for. And yes, I know there is that danger of trying to superficially Christianize the nation. But Christian witness means sometimes we have to be known for things which are bad. We have to try form coalitions and create consensus, and we have to offer an alternative way of being human. Now, some people take the view, no, what Christians need to be, they need to be, the angry prophet on the margins of society, speaking truth to power. We don't want to be seduced by the mantles of political authority. We don't want to be corrupted by the paraphernalia of political power, because it will destroy your soul, corrupt your moral vision. So we want to be on the margins, speaking truth to power. I mean, I understand that, but it's got one key problem. What do you do when the power listens? What do you do then? When you target the consciences of those in Parliament, you rub in their face their hypocrisy, you expose the evil and the greed that they have manufactured and even profited from. What happens when they repent and they say, yes, we would like you to advise us on these matters. We would like you to recommend a candidate. We would like you to be on a commission. I think if you want to build the kingdom, you've got to go into those areas. You can't simply be the prophet on the margin, because then you're just becoming snarky and snipey. If you want to change the game, you've got to have skin in the game. Yeah, I know that comes risks, but simply being a commentator on the sidelines, I don't think is necessarily the only thing we are called to. And remember, there have been many great Christian parliamentarians. I'm sure you're all aware of William Wilberforce. Yeah. And can I say, when it comes to civil disobedience, one of the most peaceful ways to change government, to change policy, to change law is by voting. By voting for people who enact good, just, and sound policies that are, right before God, right before our fellow citizens. So I don't see a problem. I don't have this this allergy, I should say, to Christians serving in public office. I know some of my Anabaptist friends think, you need to keep, you know, 3 steps of separation between you and the government. I kind of know what they're afraid of, but I don't think if we're really going to build for the kingdom, if we're going to offer Christian witness where we really can maintain that degree of separation. It's kind of like, just locking yourself in a little compound somewhere, saying the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day, baptize yourself every mode there is in case you missed one, and just waiting for God to wipe out all the heathen. And then maybe having a blog talking some smack about politicians you don't like. I don't think that's building for the kingdom. I think we've got to be out there with the people, um, you know, telling them what our convictions are. I mean, doing it with grace and with charity, not with the anger and the ferment that we see so much on television today. But I believe we can bear public witness in our parliaments, in political activism, but always aware of the risks of merely seeking power or having that over-realized eschatology. Back in a 1974, a very fortuitous year, the 1970s were a good time. You get Star Wars, you got the musical Evita, and I was born. So that's I think the 3 good things that came out of the 70s: Star Wars, Evita, and me. But it was in 1974 the Anglican Archbishop of the Church of England, Michael Ramsey, visited Chile under it's a right-wing regime. When he preached in church, an armed guard waited outside, and a correspondent with the Observer was there, and one of the soldiers asked, was there any politics in his sermon? He must stick to things of the soul because politics is for us. And he said that tapping his gun. Now, if you know anything about Michael Ramsey, he was no shrinking violet, and he was not afraid to speak out on political issues. But perhaps one of the most disturbing features of that soldier's threatening remarks is that the fact is a large number of Christians in the world probably agree with the soldier. And have accepted not just a practical separation of church and state, but a complete ontological separation of church and state. As if the state and public and politics is some kind of a disease that we are potentially going to be corrupted and malnourished by. And what often looms over this is perhaps a bad version of the two kingdoms theology. Now, the two kingdoms view goes back to Augustine. He talked about the city of God and the city of man, and this comes out differently in the Lutheran tradition. It's got a Reformed variation, it has a Baptist variation, and it's kind of like there are two distinct authorities. Now, at one level, that makes sense because you don't want to merge the two completely together. You don't want to live in a theocratic state. But the danger always is that they become completely compartmentalized and there's a huge difference between them. And we've got to be careful about that. Because we're not going to have a long tradition of social justice. It doesn't have to be a social gospel, but you're not going to have a long tradition of social justice if you're having those completely separated and compartmentalized views of church and state. It'll be difficult to advocate for religious freedom, for human rights, for religious and all sorts of different minorities, if you don't believe there are at least some relationship between church and state. And I should say there's a long tradition of Catholic social teaching about government. There's the origins of Christian socialism. Again, FYI, I'm not endorsing all things socialism, just pointing out historic fact. elements of liberation theology, even Pentecostal political theology, and more. These are all based on the idea that Christians can offer positive witness and make a public contribution to the public good and to the political systems that we live in. But in every age, in every country, every church, we must discern within the precincts of our own conscience how we understand church and state relationships, how we balance the sacred and the secular, how we are of the world but not truly in the world, how to bear theopolitical witness without becoming a theocratic menace. And I can think of numerous examples of men and women who have done great good. In the UK, you've got Archbishop William Temple or the American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who showed how Christians could, for the better, and avoiding those errors, offer a positive contribution to the political context. The danger of the two kingdoms view is we'll never be accused of being a meddlesome priest, a meddlesome pastor, or a meddlesome Christian, or we may become morally indifferent to the crises of our own age. If we stuck to this complete separation of church and state, there would be no William Wilberforce and the abolitionist movement. There would be no Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. There would be no Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia and no Christmas Revolution in Romania. If Christians did not take a stand against those things, perhaps communism would still be there in the Eastern European countries. Last night I began reading a wonderful autobiography by a Catholic Czech priest called Thomas Harlech. I mean, you probably haven't heard of him, but he was very instrumental in the Czech democratic movement. He was there during the worst days of communism, and he was there when they started to rebuild Czechia and turn it into a free democratic country. And he talks with great pain about the friends, the family who had to flee, were imprisoned, and some who were killed. We should never take our rights and freedoms for granted. And when the day, or should the day ever come, we need to make sure that we have the courage and conviction to stand up for them, not just our rights or Christian privileges, but also for the rights and freedoms of others, because we believe that is what it is to be a human being. It's free to know God and to enjoy Him forever. As a Christian, I pray, and this is where I'll land. As a Christian, I pray for God's kingdom to come on an earth as it is in heaven. If I and you are to be true to the giver of that prayer, then, like the first Christian generation who prayed it and lived it, we must be building, working, and praying for the kingdom, acting in all earnestness for a state of affairs in which the world of the state, society, and politics, no less than my private life or spiritual life, is attended to the lordship of King Jesus. A lordship that's not established by terror or tanks, but by the fruit of the Spirit's effervescent life. That kind of prayer is the church's program. That type of prayer is how we do God in public. And there, my dear friends, is where I think I will end. I think it's now time for some lectures and possibly, I've got a hankering for some Canada Dry now, I'll tell you that much. All this talk of ginger ale is making me thirsty. Okay, and can I say thank you very much for bearing with me. This is the first time I've tried out these lectures. If you want to see or know more, a more polished version of them, the book Jesus and the Powers comes out in, I think, the end of March. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. So who would have a question you'd like to pose to Dr. Burton? Matthew, you can prime the pump again, brother. Get us going, and you got to be in there. You got another one.
So I'm interested in Alberta from the 30s right through to 1962. Alberta was governed by two premiers, Bill Aberhart and Ernest Manning, who were active pastors.
Yep.
While also being premiers, while leading the government, and were quite explicit in the fact that their Christianity guided and governed their policy.
Yep.
Is that something that you would be in favor of or encourage, or do you see a problem in that?
Yes and no. I don't think a person who is serving in government, particularly in the office of premier, should be actively a pastor of a church, because your energy, your time, and your labor should be focused on a good governance of the state. And while I think it is okay to say that you allow your Christian conscience to guide you in very policy matters, I mean that's true for any human being. Um, you do have to do that with some footnotes or an asterisk saying, I also recognize that I'm here to govern on behalf of all Canadians, not just the Baptists, not just the Christians, not just the white people. I'm here to govern on behalf of all Albertans. Okay, as long as you've got that kind of caveat going on, and what you do meets with the consensus of the people, I think it's okay. Because remember, as I said yesterday, I think that there is always going to be a slight connection between religion and politics, because your governments make laws, laws are based on policies, policies are shaped by values, and religion does feed into values. So I don't think you can have a hard, complete separation of religion from politics unless you ban people of faith from serving in public office, ban them from voting, ban them from attending political parties or expressing political opinions. The only way to completely get out religion from politics is taking some real, like, Stalinist measures and repressing all religious people in the state. But to do that, you'd run roughshod over a whole bunch of human rights, freedom of speech, religion, and association. So with qualifications, I partly think that's right. Not being the pastor of a church while you do it. But I think you can govern out of Christian convictions, and a Muslim is free to govern out of Muslim convictions, and a atheist or I don't know, a Rastafarian is free to govern out of Rastafarian convictions. I have no idea what convictions Justin Trudeau is governing out of. I won't speculate against them, for or against. Yeah, but I mean, we should everyone is permitted to follow their conscience in how they contribute to the betterment of the state and its people.
Thank you. Someone else? Yes.
Thank you for your speech. So when you were talking about there's some hills that you wouldn't die on, like, for example, banning dancing, to, the extreme of, like, well, churches, you can't be a part of a church. Is there some kind of a triage or some kind of a way to look at certain issues and realize, okay, which ones are worth fighting for, which ones are ones that are not? What kind of things do we engage with that? Bringing in the tradition, bringing in scripture. Is there a way to kind of think through these things to kind of see what are issues that we should be fighting for? What are issues that we should maybe take a step back
Yeah,
on?
I would say that the things you don't want to fight for are merely symbols of Christian hegemony or symbols of Christian privilege. Okay, so let me give two examples. Like opening the Australian Federal Parliament with prayer. Again, that's not the hill I'm going to die on. Similarly, you could say in America there was some courthouse somewhere that had the Ten Commandments out front. Now, I think you could make a case that the Ten Commandments are laws that kind of the nation are based on. So there's nothing particularly harmful, or not like you're proselytizing anyone doing it, or anything. So I think you could make a case it's legit to have them there. But again, that's not the hill I want to die on. I mean, if they remove the Ten Commandments monument, Jesus is still Lord. I can still practice my faith, and the sun will still come up tomorrow. What I'm concerned about things that the hills we need to die on are the things where you have rampant government corruption, coercion in matters of religion, or discrimination against people, of all faiths or no faith. I think those are the things that we need to be aggressively loud on. Now, how you do that will often depend on your own context and your own conviction. I don't have a magical, 12-point formula which I can give you. But I think that the things that are merely symbolic, the things that are symbols of Christian hegemony, or the things that are like intrusive into people's lives, like, hey, look, I'd love to ban cigarettes. I mean, Look, I mean, I've never understood the attraction. I mean, my view is anything you stick in your mouth and set on fire, it's not going well. Whether that's a newspaper, a bottle of metho, or a squirrel, anything you put in your mouth and set on fire, nothing good's going to come of that. I can tell you now. But I don't know whether I want to be Big Brother and completely regulating people's lives. People, I mean, if you live in a somewhat expressive liberal society, people have the right to do the things they see fit. It comes down to the detriment that it burdens others with. So, yeah.
Hello. My question would be, do we as the church should be careful with the people that want to seek a political career in the sense of their integrity? I mean, do we need to check if, I don't know, normal people at church should be holding a grade of integrity, but since politicians will be representatives from a certain community or Christian community, should we be careful with them to show them that they have a calling of integrity? Should we be more careful to show them that they will be our representatives, or they just need to hold to the same values as all of the Christian communities? Should we think of this political career as a calling, or it's just as everybody else?
Well, I think you can think of it as a calling. Some people are a calling, and in divine providence, they do end up with a career in politics, either as a staffer or in government or in parliament. I think we should definitely pray for those people. I think we should definitely exhort them to follow their conscience and do what is best for the people that they are so governing. One of the interesting things comes up, should churches discipline members of their congregation who are involved in parliament who may pass legislation which goes against the church's doctrine? Now, the most famous examples of this, there's a number of Catholic politicians in America, and there are a number of Catholic cardinals who think you shouldn't give communion to like President Joe Biden or Nancy Pelosi or others because of their views of abortion. Yeah, I mean that's a tricky one. That's a tricky one. I think I I'll never forget. A Anglican friend told me that in at a chapel at Harvard, the day after the election, when Donald Trump was made president, or the next Sunday, the priest stood up and said, "If you voted for Donald Trump, you may not come and receive communion." Which I thought was, I mean, I'd say that's heresy. I mean, that you can't do that. You can't say. I mean, if the priest wants to go on a bit of a rant about everyone, I mean, well, like he can do that, but you can't. I don't know if you start depriving people of communion for some political things, it's going to go in a very messy direction. So I would be very, I mean, particularly believe in freedom of conscience. So I would be reluctant to go around churches disciplining people. I would be a little bit more critical of people who were collaborating with a evil authoritarian regime. So if you're part of a regime where the government's political opponents start going missing or end up, in a ditch dead, and you're part of that government, maybe something like that for me may be a cause of church discipline. And this has been an issue in some places in Latin America. I know some people have served in Latin America, but if the local drug traffickers come to church for communion, do you turn them away? Some bishops do, some don't, or some clergy do and don't. And so that's kind of like a bit of a moral problem you have, or an ethical conundrum you have different parts in the world.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah, thank you for your wonderful lectures. My question is, I'm not going to rehash if you think churches should or should not have stayed open during COVID and all that, but I did have an acquaintance whose concern was that if you're okay with the government legislating minor matters, then they will just go along with whatever. So could you maybe elaborate on, I think it's that the appropriate response, but the area of cooperation where you can submit to and cooperate with something, even if you have objections about it, like you don't think it's just?
Yeah, well, this was an issue in Australia as well and in America. I think for the most part, churches were willing to go along with it because they thought it was the right thing to do. It was in the interest of public health and safety. One of the best statements on religious freedom is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 18. I urge you to go all and read it. It is a very comprehensive and robust statement of religious freedom. It states what religious freedom is and what it encompasses, and very good. In fact, in Australia, I would argue that a lot of government policies and religion are really based on trying to circumvent it, trying to get around the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And that offers a thing. It says, look, governments can slightly curtail religious freedom for public health and safety, and a pandemic would do it. So government can limit religious freedom in emergency situations. But there are limits to the limits that you can put on religious freedom, and they're spelled out in a document called the Syracuse Principles, where they're showing how governments can and cannot do derogations of human rights during crisis times. Like, when there's a war on, like occupational health and safety kind of goes out the window. When you're trying to, do things. All the soldiers on the back of the truck may not be wearing seatbelts, stuff like that. Similarly, in religious freedom, I think you could make a case based on international law that governments were within their right to restrict religious freedom to some degree. The issue was it necessary and was it proportionate? Okay. Now, there were some jurisdictions in Australia when they started to relax the restrictions, they were very uneven in how they relaxed them. So they would not relax them for church services and funerals, but they did relax them for casinos and brothels. Okay, which some people said, well, that's kind of unfair. There was one incident in Western Australia where, to go to church, everyone was meant to have a vaccine certificate saying that they're vaccinated so they can attend a public meeting. And there was one person at this church who was worried that another person wasn't vaccinated, so they called the police. And the police came and then shut down the church service and then investigated everyone's immunization status. That, I think, went too far. And I think that was intrusive. I would have said, look, you're more than welcome to, investigate people's status before and after the service, but I'm not shutting down the service so you can go around checking people's, vaccination status, because that just sounds a little bit too much like East Germany, sadly, in the 1970s. So there was something bad in the 1970s. What I'd say, yeah, so I think we can, for the benefit of loving our neighbors, occasionally, and to the right proportion, for the right reason, lay aside some of our religious freedoms for simply for loving our neighbor. That was my view. What I would say, I think we've learned in hindsight of the COVID pandemic is three things, and these are the three takeaways. Number one, we often ended up treating people as walking biohazards rather than as actual human beings. Okay? We treated people as if they were biohazards, as if everyone's just a big spongy ball of bacteria or viral stuff. Secondly, I thought there was a lot of disrespecting of conscience. Okay, I believe freedom of conscience is very important. And yes, we balance freedom of conscience with the detriment upon others. But if you don't get vaccinated, you're primarily a danger to yourself, not so much a danger to others. Now, maybe there's a physician here or a medical practitioner will disagree with me. Fine, but getting vaccinated, there were risks, and I've got at least two friends who have vaccine-related injuries. One friend has got myocarditis, and another friend, after getting vaccinated, went deaf in one ear. Okay, these were the risks, but there's risks with all vaccinations. We should know, and if some people are fit and healthy, maybe they don't want to take the risk, and they should be able to exercise their conscience without getting punitive measures from the government. At the moment, the Australian Open is playing in Melbourne, and about 2 years ago, Well, number one, Novak Djokovic, who's not anti-vax, but he's more of a kind of, what do you call it, like a, not the Texas anti-vax, more like California anti-vax. If you know what I mean. Um, he's not the kind of, you can't muzzle me with a mask, to more kind of like the vegan tofu variety. And he just didn't like putting yucky stuff in his body, whether that's meat or gluten. And he had no problem with other people vaccinating. He just didn't want to do it himself because he's in pretty good condition. And the state government said he could come. The government organized, the open organizers said he could come, but no one asked the federal government. And so when he came, he was strictly in violation of the immigration policy on COVID vaccines and the like. And the poor guy ended up under house arrest for 2 weeks before finally being exited from the country. And he was given the cruel nickname No Vax rather than Novak. I thought that was unfair. I thought that was unfair, and I think we should support freedom of conscience. And probably the third thing I think we've learned from the pandemic, we really underestimated the mental health price of locking people down, keeping kids out of schools. I think we really underestimated that. Now, for me, as a very profound introvert, I know you may not believe that. I'm kind of like a performative introvert. I can come out and perform, but I really do live inside my head. So, like, I didn't mind COVID that much. No commute to work. Classes got kind of, kind of cut down a bit. Instead of a 3-hour meeting in person, we had 40-minute meetings on Zoom. My productivity went up. I kind of liked it. But about 2 weeks into the lockdown, I found my wife in the living room sobbing because she just couldn't bear it anymore. It was like a fun novelty to begin with. But after 2 weeks, and like a bit of cabin fever was setting, and I said to honey, what's wrong? She goes, I want to see people. I said, but I'm people. And she said, I want to see proper people. Now, the introvert me did not understand, but yeah, I mean, it took a very big mental health toll. And man, that the number of teenagers and I've known who have had real issues afterwards and have gone off the rails in some really bad ways as soon as lockdown ended. Yeah, so that's the three things I think we've learned from the pandemic. Shouldn't treat human beings as biohazards. We need to defend freedom of conscience, and we shouldn't underestimate the mental health crisis that the countermeasures, however necessary, created.
Sorry. So there's my question is that there is recently been a rise in like a religious satirical movement in politics used to like point out problems of religious involvement, too much religious involvement in politics. Do you see this as a healthy check or as a over divisive measure, like it causes this too much of a division that you had mentioned earlier, or is it a healthy check on the separation of church and state?
So there are people making fun of religious politicians. Is that effectively it?
No, so like stuff like Pastafarianism, like the belief in the flying spaghetti, like made up religions that are kind of
Yeah.
poking at religious freedoms.
I mean, well, if they're poking at religious freedoms, you can poke back. I mean, that's one way. That's one way to do it. But I would say the critique of religion, organized religion, any religion, is okay, because if you start doing that, if you start banning the critique of religion, you're effectively bringing in blasphemy laws. And and again, there's the problem: who gets to determine what is blasphemous? There's a famous Latin proverb that says, "Offenses against the gods are the gods' concern." So if there is some kind of little smart aleck comedian who's making fun of religion, it's like an ant, mocking the moon. The ant will be gone soon, but the moon will still be there. So yeah. So I mean, depending. I mean, some of them can be quite insightful critiques of religion, and a sobering wake-up call. Other of them are just juvenile attention speakers, speaking to their own little in-group.